Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt the weight of judgmental stares? Not because you did anything wrong, but simply because you didn't fit the mold. Marcus Carter knows that feeling all too well. As a successful black businessman, he's faced the silent skepticism, the polite yet condescending remarks, the doors that close just a little too quickly, all because of prejudice. But there's one thing people like Veronica Summers never see coming. Underestimating the wrong person can be the biggest mistake of their lives. On this flight, an arrogant flight attendant, an innocent child, and a hidden truth will collide in a confrontation no one expected. Veronica Summers believes she has the power to decide who belongs in first class and who doesn't. What she doesn't realize is that she just chose the wrong battle. A confined cabin, a system designed to silence injustice, and a woman convinced of her untouchable authority. But this time, the truth won't stay buried. As the plane takes off, so does a war over privilege, morality, and justice. Do those who abuse their power ever truly go unpunished? Can justice be served when an entire cabin chooses to stay silent? And most importantly, what happens when those who judge others are forced to face their own reckoning? Stay with this story until the very end, because I promise you, not everyone will land safely after what's about to unfold. If you believe in justice should never go unchecked, hit like, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. The first-class cabin of Flight 217 was a sanctuary of exclusivity. At least, that's what its wealthier passengers believed. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses made it a world apart from the cramped conditions in economy. For those who paid a premium, this was their escape from the noise and inconvenience of the common traveler. But today, their illusion of serenity was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a crying child. It started as a faint whimper, barely audible over the hum of the engines. Then it grew into sniffles, tiny hiccups of distress. Soon, the little boy, no older than 2, let out a wail, his chubby fists clenching in frustration. His mother, a composed woman in her early 30s, gently rocked him in her arms, whispering soothing words. Her dark brown curls framed a face that was clearly exhausted, but determined to calm her child. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy suit sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes at his seatmate. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "First class isn't what it used to be." His words weren't meant to be heard by the mother, but they cut through the air like a blade. A few others exchanged looks of disapproval. One woman tapped furiously at her phone, perhaps drafting a complaint to the airline. That was when Veronica Summers entered the scene. At 42, Veronica had spent nearly 2 decades as a flight attendant, working her way up to head stewardess. Her crisp uniform hugged her athletic frame, and her blonde hair was pinned into a severe bun, not a strand out of place. She prided herself on keeping order, ensuring first-class passengers experienced the luxury they paid for. Today, she saw that order unraveling before her eyes. Her heels clicked sharply against the aisle as she made her way toward the source of the disruption. Passengers watched expectantly, waiting for her to restore peace. Veronica's lips curled into a tight, practiced smile as she leaned down, addressing the mother. "Ma'am," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled condescension, "I understand that traveling with children can be difficult, but you'll need to control your son." The mother, still bouncing the child gently, looked up, her hazel eyes calm but unwavering. "I'm doing my best. He's just tired. Give me a minute and he'll settle." Veronica's smile thinned. "The passengers around you have paid for a comfortable experience. If you can't keep him quiet, I may have to ask you to relocate." The mother's jaw tightened. "Relocate where? This is our assigned seat. We paid for first class just like everyone else." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers pretended not to listen, while others stared, intrigued. Veronica straightened, glancing at the passengers who had already complained with sympathetic annoyance. "I understand, ma'am," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "But first class has certain standards, and excessive noise isn't part of them." The child, as if sensing the tension, wailed louder. Veronica's patience snapped. Her fingers clenched at her sides before she exhaled sharply, forcing a strained politeness into her expression. "I'll give you 5 minutes. If the noise continues, I'll have to take further action." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her posture stiff. She didn't miss the look of disbelief on the mother's face. The passengers settled back into their seats, pretending to ignore the situation, but a few exchanged quiet whispers. The mother continued her attempts to calm her son, now bouncing him on her knee. But the energy in the cabin had shifted. The silent judgment, the hostile stares. It was clear she and her child were unwelcome. Minutes passed, and the child finally began to quiet, hiccuping softly as he nuzzled against his mother's shoulder. Just when it seemed the tension might ease, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "This is ridiculous." The man in the Navy suit from earlier turned in his seat to glare at the mother. "If you can't control him, you shouldn't bring him into first class. There are families back in economy for a reason." The mother's lips parted, stunned by the blatant rudeness. Before she could respond, Veronica was back, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the confrontation. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though it was clear she was already siding with the passenger. The mother swallowed hard, adjusting her hold on her son. "No problem," she said, voice tight. Veronica arched an eyebrow. "Good. Let's keep it that way." With that, she turned and strode away once more, but the damage was done. The mother wasn't just an inconvenience now. She was a target, and the flight had barely begun. The tension in the first-class cabin hung thick like a storm cloud, heavy with silent judgment and whispered disapproval. The mother, clutching her son, rocked him gently, her touch a desperate plea for comfort. The child, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar setting, let out another soft whimper. Veronica Summers, watching from a few rows away, felt her irritation spike. She had given the woman enough time to quiet the child, and yet, here they were, still disrupting the luxury experience her passengers expected. The privileged murmurs of the first-class guests only fueled her resolve. She moved swiftly, her heels clicking against the plush carpet as she strode toward the woman with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. "All right, enough," Veronica snapped, her voice sharp enough to turn heads. She folded her arms, towering over the mother. "I gave you a chance to handle this. It's clear you can't." The mother, exhausted but composed, looked up. "I'm trying," she said, her voice tight with restraint. "He's just a baby." Veronica exhaled sharply through her nose, a condescending smirk pulling at her lips. "A baby that's disturbing everyone in this cabin. First class isn't a daycare. If you can't keep him quiet, you need to leave." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances, sensing the hostility escalating. The mother's eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me." Veronica leaned in, lowering her voice, but making sure everyone around them could still hear. "I said," she enunciated each word with venomous precision, "if you can't control him, you don't belong here." The mother flinched, her grip tightening around her son. The boy, sensing the rising distress, let out a sharp, panicked wail. Veronica's patience snapped. In one sudden, horrifying motion, she raised her hand and slapped the child across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence of the cabin. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Passengers froze, their champagne glasses hovering midair, their conversations cut short. Even the soft hum of the engines felt distant. The little boy's cry cut off abruptly, his tiny body stiffening in shock before he let out a heart-wrenching scream of terror. The mother jerked back, horrified, her hand instinctively covering her son's reddened cheek. Then realization sank in. She shot up from her seat. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she roared, her voice shaking with fury. Veronica did not flinch. She merely adjusted her uniform, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. "I did what you failed to do," she said coldly. "I silenced him." Passengers gasped audibly now, a few of them whispering in stunned disbelief. Even those who had originally been annoyed by the crying child looked uneasy. The mother, trembling with rage, pulled her son close. "You put your hands on my child," she said, her voice dangerously low. Veronica rolled her eyes. "Oh, relax," she said dismissively. "I barely touched him." Then, with chilling finality, she added, "If you can't control your emotions either, perhaps you both need to be escorted off a plane." The mother's breath hitched. "You're throwing us off the flight? For what? Because he cried? Because I defended my son after you assaulted him?" Veronica arched an eyebrow. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said simply. "But if you refuse to comply, I will have security remove you." A slow, uneasy shift passed through the cabin. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to see. Others cast glances of pity toward the mother, but said nothing. No one spoke up for her. Veronica turned toward the galley, signaling to a nearby flight attendant. "Call the captain. Tell him we have a disruptive passenger refusing to cooperate." The mother's heart pounded. She was alone in this fight, and her son, her terrified innocent son, was trembling in her arms. Veronica Summers had just crossed a line no one should ever cross, and the flight was far from over. The mother clutched her son, her arms tightening protectively around his small frame, as if her embrace could shield him from the cruel world unfolding before him. His small sniffles had quieted, but his body still trembled against her, shaken and confused. Veronica Summers stood tall, her smirk laced with satisfaction. "Since you refuse to comply, I have no choice but to involve security," she announced, her voice ringing through the cabin with icy authority. A few rows away, Grace, the young flight attendant, froze. Her grip on the drink tray tightened, but she didn't dare speak. The mother's breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling with barely restrained fury. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, her voice shaking but firm. "You humiliate us, assault my child, and now you're trying to force us out?" Veronica arched an eyebrow. "It's not personal," she said smoothly. "It's about maintaining order in first class. If you can't respect that, you'll be seated elsewhere." As if on cue, two uniformed security officers entered the cabin, their expressions unreadable as they surveyed the situation. One was an older man with graying temples, his posture exuding quiet authority. The other was younger, clearly still learning to balance professionalism with the human cost of his job. The older officer took a step forward. "We were told there's an issue." Veronica gestured toward the mother, her expression one of mock disappointment. "This passenger has been disruptive since boarding and refuses to comply with flight crew instructions. I'm requesting that she and her child be relocated." The mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Disruptive?" she echoed, her voice breaking slightly. "You mean I refuse to let you slap my child without consequences?" The officer's eyes flickered to Veronica, but she remained perfectly composed, as if the accusation was beneath her. "She's exaggerating," she said coolly. "I did what any responsible crew member would do when a child is screaming uncontrollably." A murmur passed through the cabin, but no one openly objected. Some passengers looked visibly uncomfortable. Others focused on their in-flight menus, as if pretending this wasn't happening. The younger officer hesitated. "Shouldn't we?" The senior officer cut him off with a sharp look before turning back to the mother. "Ma'am, we don't want to escalate this further. Please cooperate so we can resolve the situation peacefully." The mother swallowed hard, her pride warring with the weight of the moment. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Veronica sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. "Then we'll have to consider further action, including possible legal consequences for failing to comply with federal aviation rules." The mother stiffened. Her stomach churned as the reality of the situation crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was fighting to stay on this flight at all. She scanned the faces around her one last time, searching for even a shred of humanity. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, but kept his eyes trained on his tablet. The elderly woman near the window gripped her purse tightly, looking out as if the clouds outside were more pressing than the injustice happening in front of her. No one spoke up. The weight of that realization settled in her bones. Finally, she took a breath, her hands shaking as she adjusted the strap of her bag. "Fine," she whispered. The officers stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She didn't look at Veronica. She wouldn't give that woman the satisfaction. She adjusted her grip on her son, pressing a kiss to his temple. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, even though nothing about this was okay. As she took her first step toward the back of the plane, Veronica leaned in slightly, her voice a low, mocking whisper. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" The mother bit her lip until she tasted blood. With slow, measured steps, she walked down the narrow aisle, past rows of indifferent passengers, past luxury she had paid for but was deemed unworthy of enjoying. The business class divider loomed ahead like a wall separating two worlds. She crossed through it, disappearing into the cramped space beyond. Behind her, Veronica returned to her post, her expression one of complete triumph. The mother stepped past the curtain dividing first class from business, her grip on her son tightening as she moved through the narrow aisle. The murmurs of economy passengers filled the space, a stark contrast to the icy silence she had just endured. She found an empty row and sank into the seat, gently rocking her child in an effort to soothe him. His tiny fingers clung to her blouse, his body still tense. Behind her, first class had not yet settled. The confrontation had rattled some passengers more than they cared to admit. The man in the navy suit, one of the loudest complainers earlier, seemed perfectly content, leaning back in his seat with a smug expression. But others weren't so sure. A middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, seated 2 rows from where the mother had been, shifted uncomfortably. Her manicured fingers drummed against the armrest as she cast a glance at her husband, who was reading a financial magazine as if nothing had happened. She leaned closer. "That was excessive, don't you think?" she whispered. Her husband didn't look up. "We paid for peace and quiet." She should have controlled her kid. She pursed her lips, dissatisfied with the answer. Further down the aisle, a young man in a sharp gray suit, likely a corporate executive, pulled out his phone, subtly unlocking the camera app. He had filmed part of the confrontation, and the footage now replayed silently on his screen. His jaw clenched as he watched Veronica's smirk, the way she had leaned in just before the mother walked away, whispering something no one else could hear. The cruelty in her posture, the arrogance in her eyes. It left a bitter taste in his mouth. He glanced at the businessman across from him, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, sipping a glass of bourbon. "Did that seem right to you?" he asked quietly. The older man sighed and set his glass down. "No," he admitted, "but it's not my battle to fight." The younger man frowned. Meanwhile, Veronica resumed her rounds as if nothing had happened, her mood noticeably lighter. She greeted a white-haired couple in the first row with a dazzling smile, offering them complimentary champagne. As she poured, the elderly man chuckled. "You certainly run a tight ship, young lady." Veronica beamed, as if the entire incident had been validation of her authority. "I do my best to maintain order," she said. Behind her, a voice broke the air. "Excuse me." The sound was firm but not loud. It carried weight, the kind that made people instinctively turn their heads. A man stood near the aisle, his posture composed yet commanding. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His deep brown skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white of his shirt, and his dark eyes held an intensity that made Veronica's practiced smile falter for just a second. "Yes?" she asked, regaining her composure. The man tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to ask," he said smoothly, "is this how first-class passengers are treated on this airline?" A ripple of tension moved through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances. The silver-haired woman straightened in her seat, suddenly paying very close attention. Veronica blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry. You heard me," the man replied. His tone remained polite, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "I've flown with this airline many times, and I've never seen a paying passenger and her child forced to leave first class over something so minor." A charged silence followed. The young executive with the phone subtly angled his camera, ensuring it captured everything. Veronica's smile tightened. "Sir, the situation was handled according to protocol." The passenger in question was disruptive and refused to comply with crew instructions. Disruptive how? The man pressed. By defending her son after he was struck. A few shocked gasps escaped from passengers who hadn't realized that detail before. The silver-haired woman turned fully in her seat now, eyes wide. Veronica's fingers twitched. "Sir, I assure you, you're assuring me of what exactly?" the man interrupted. "That first-class service includes physically disciplining passengers' children when they cry? That security is called not on those who overstep their authority, but on those who dare to object." Veronica's face paled slightly. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a chime echoed through the cabin. The intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 38,000 feet. Flight attendants, please prepare for meal service." The announcement did little to dissolve the tension. The man in the charcoal suit hadn't moved, his eyes still locked onto Veronica, waiting for an answer she didn't have. The silver-haired woman looked between them, her expression firming. With quiet resolve, the young executive with the phone stopped recording, but he wasn't putting the device away. He was waiting, calculating. The mother sat stiffly in her new cramped seat, gripping her son tightly as he nestled into her chest, exhausted from crying. The humiliation of being forced out of first class burned deep, but she refused to break down in front of the passengers who had watched silently as it happened. Just beyond the curtain, first class had settled back into a false sense of order. Veronica had resumed her duties, ensuring champagne flutes were refilled and dinner menus were distributed, acting as if the incident had never occurred. But not everyone was willing to let it go. The man in the charcoal suit, the one who had publicly questioned Veronica, still had his eyes locked onto her. He wasn't speaking anymore, but his posture remained tense, his jaw tight. The young executive who had recorded the earlier altercation hadn't put his phone away, his fingers hovering over the screen, waiting for another moment worth capturing. Veronica felt their scrutiny, but she pushed down her unease. She was in control here. At least, she thought she was. From the back of the plane, the mother had reached her breaking point. She took a steadying breath before pressing the flight attendant. Call button. The small chime rang overhead. A few moments later, a junior flight attendant, a redhead named Grace, appeared, her features clouded with uncertainty. "Ma'am, how can I assist you?" The mother's voice was calm but firm. "I need to speak with the captain." Grace blinked. "I'm sorry. I need to speak with the captain," the mother repeated, enunciating each word carefully. "Now." Grace hesitated. Passengers didn't just speak with the captain mid-flight unless there was an emergency. "May I ask what this is regarding?" The mother lifted her chin. "A complaint. About your lead flight attendant." Grace froze. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, where Veronica was still playing the perfect hostess. I don't know if that's possible," Grace admitted carefully. "The captain is. I don't care how busy he is," the mother interrupted. "I have been harassed, humiliated, and physically separated from my seat. I have a right to speak with him." Grace hesitated, clearly torn between procedure and conscience. But before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Is there a problem here?" Veronica stood just behind Grace, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes gleaming with quiet menace. Grace stepped back immediately, silently retreating into the background as Veronica took her place. The mother sat straighter in her seat. "Yes," she said evenly. "I need to speak with the captain." Veronica let out a small, mocking laugh. "The captain," she repeated, as if the request were absurd. "I'm afraid that's not how this works." The mother's hands clenched into fists. "I know how it works," she shot back. "And I also know that passengers have the right to escalate complaints when mistreated by crew members." Veronica sighed dramatically, shaking her head like a parent indulging a child's tantrum. "Let me make something clear," she said, leaning down slightly so only the mother could hear. "The captain has a flight to operate. He doesn't have time for people like you causing unnecessary disruptions." A chill crept down the mother's spine. It wasn't just what Veronica had said, it was the way she said it. People like me, she repeated softly, her voice laced with warning. Veronica didn't back down. Instead, she offered a small, infuriating smirk. You heard me, she said simply. Something in the mother's gaze hardened, but before she could respond, the intercom crackled to life. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff. The cabin doors locked with a mechanical hiss. Veronica straightened, satisfied. Looks like your timing is off, she said casually. Maybe you'll have better luck complaining once we land. Then, without another word, she turned and strode back toward first class, her dominance re-established. The mother closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. She had lost this round, but the fight wasn't over. Back in first class, Veronica resumed her duties, but something felt different now. The man in the charcoal suit hadn't stopped watching her, and neither had the young executive with the phone. Even the silver-haired woman from earlier was now visibly tense, her earlier neutrality replaced by discomfort. We'll have to flag you for non-compliance. That could get you permanently banned from flying with us. Surely you wouldn't want that. The mother's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms, but she forced herself to release the bag. She watched in horror as the attendants unzipped it and tipped it over completely, spilling her belongings onto the floor. A phone charger tumbled out, a pack of wipes, a small makeup pouch, but worst of all, a tiny wooden airplane. Her son's favorite toy hit the floor and rolled beneath a seat. Her little boy, who had finally begun to settle, saw it fall and immediately burst into fresh sobs. He reached for it desperately, his tiny hands clawing at the seatbelt, keeping him in place. Mama, my plane. The mother's vision blurred with tears, but she dropped to her knees without hesitation, frantically gathering her things. Her fingers fumbled as she reached for the wooden airplane, her son's cries growing louder. Passengers in the surrounding seats shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Meanwhile, Veronica stood above her, arms crossed, her expression smug. Losing something? She mused. The mother snatched up the toy, pressing it into her son's tiny hands. Here, baby, she whispered, smoothing his curls, her voice wavering but gentle. But Veronica wasn't finished. Maybe next time, she said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. You'll remember that first class is a privilege, not a right. A few people chuckled quietly, though most simply looked away, pretending not to be part of this cruelty. The mother didn't move. She stayed on her knees for a second longer, her entire body trembling, her rage boiling beneath the surface. She had never felt so powerless. But she wouldn't stay that way. She took a slow, shaky breath, lifting her head just enough to meet Veronica's gaze. And in that moment, she committed every detail of this woman's face to memory. The mother barely had time to collect herself when the next blow landed. From a few rows ahead, a wealthy-looking older man in an expensive gray blazer lowered his newspaper with an exaggerated sigh. He removed his reading glasses, his blue eyes filled with irritation, and turned toward Veronica. Are we going to have to listen to this all flight? He asked, gesturing lazily toward the mother and her child. His voice carried the distinct tone of someone used to getting what he wanted, without question. Veronica's lips curled into a knowing smile. I was just about to take care of that, sir. The mother stiffened. Take care of what? Veronica faced her with mock sympathy. I was willing to let you stay, but if you're still going to be disruptive, we'll need to find you a more suitable place. The mother's hands clenched into tight fists. We're already in economy. Where exactly do you plan to move us now? Veronica's smirk widened. The last row should be empty. It's close to the restrooms, so it might be more comfortable for you. A few soft chuckles rippled through the cabin. The mother's breath caught. She had already been shoved out of first class, her dignity stripped in front of everyone. And now, they wanted to bury her even deeper. She shook her head, her voice coming out in a sharp whisper. I am not moving again. Veronica's expression turned ice cold. Then we'll have security move you. For a moment, there was only silence. Passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. A middle-aged man in a navy polo clenched his jaw and looked like he wanted to say something. But then his wife grabbed his arm and whispered, Don't get involved." The mother's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her son, sensing her distress, gripped her shirt tightly. She should have known no one would help. She should have known the rules were different for people like her. "Final chance," Veronica said, her patience running out. "Either you go willingly, or we have you removed." The mother's heart pounded. She couldn't fight anymore. Slowly, painfully, she rose from her seat, her head held high despite the way her body trembled. The weight of the humiliation, the anger, the absolute injustice of it all burned through her, but she refused to let them see her break. She adjusted the strap of her bag, lifted her son into her arms, and turned toward the long walk to the back of the plane. Behind her, Veronica sighed with satisfaction. Passengers watched in silence, some with hidden guilt, others with open indifference. But just as the mother reached the halfway point of the aisle, someone cleared their throat. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. A deep, commanding voice followed. "I'd like to know," the voice said, calm yet razor-sharp, "who gave you the authority to treat a paying passenger like a criminal?" The mother froze in place. Veronica did too. Slowly, all heads turned toward the speaker. The man in the charcoal suit stood up from his seat in first class, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniably powerful. He wasn't asking a question. He was giving an order. Silence stretched through the first-class cabin, thick and suffocating. Veronica's smirk had vanished, replaced by a stiff, calculating expression, as she turned toward the man who had just spoken. He stood with an air of quiet authority, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable, his movements deliberate. His presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere, the easy confidence in his posture demanding attention without effort. The mother remained frozen, her son still clinging to her. For the first time since boarding this flight, she felt something other than helplessness. Veronica regained her composure quickly. "Sir," she said, keeping her tone measured, "I understand this may seem unfair, but I assure you, our policies are in place to." The man held up a hand. A simple gesture, but it silenced her instantly. "I didn't ask for an explanation," he said. "I asked who gave you the authority to treat a passenger like this." Passengers exchanged looks, some shifting uncomfortably. The young executive who had been recording earlier subtly angled his phone again, realizing something far bigger was unfolding. Veronica hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across her face. She didn't know who this man was, but something about him made her tread carefully. "Sir, A sudden jolt rocked the plane as someone stepped into the first-class cabin. A man, dressed in a perfectly pressed pilot's uniform, entered with long, purposeful strides. The 4 golden stripes on his shoulder epaulets marked him as the captain. His sharp blue eyes swept the cabin before locking onto the man in the suit. And in that instant, Veronica knew something was wrong. The captain's face paled visibly. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Then, much to the shock of everyone watching, he inclined his head in a respectful nod. "Sir Anderson," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I wasn't aware you were on this flight. Is this an unannounced inspection?" A few passengers gasped softly, while others whispered hurriedly to one another. Veronica's entire body stiffened. "Anderson." Her stomach dropped like a stone. She slowly turned back toward the man in the charcoal suit, the man she had dismissed without a second thought just moments ago. James Anderson, a CEO, billionaire, the owner of the very airline she worked for. Her lips parted slightly, her throat suddenly dry. James simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. But the silence in the cabin was deafening, the weight of his gaze enough to make every inch of her skin prickle with dread. "Captain," James said smoothly, his voice betraying nothing. "I'm sure you were just about to explain why my flight crew is harassing a paying customer instead of ensuring this flight runs smoothly." The captain's jaw tightened. His gaze flickered to Veronica. But before he could finish, Veronica did something she had never done before. She panicked. "This is a misunderstanding," she blurted out, her voice tight. "This woman was being disruptive, and I was simply following standard procedure." James tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Standard procedure? He echoed. There was no emotion in his voice. No anger. No frustration. Just a terrifying calmness. And somehow that was worse. Passengers sat deathly still, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The mother, still holding her son, dared to glance up. For the first time, she saw the shift happening. Veronica was no longer the one in control. James let out a slow exhale, then turned to the captain. "And you allowed this?" The captain stiffened, but chose his words carefully. "Sir, I wasn't aware." James didn't let him finish. He finally moved, taking a single measured step forward, closing the space between him and Veronica. And then he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that reassured. It was the kind that made blood run cold. Veronica's breath hitched. "Miss Summers," James said, his tone polite, too polite. "Since you're so fond of enforcing policies, let me remind you of one." Veronica swallowed, her palms suddenly clammy. "The number one rule for flight attendants," James continued, "is to ensure the comfort and safety of every passenger, regardless of status, appearance, or any other factor that shouldn't matter." His gaze hardened. "So tell me, Miss Summers, how exactly does slapping a child align with that policy?" Veronica's knees nearly buckled. Murmurs exploded through the cabin, passengers now openly whispering. The silver-haired woman from earlier looked scandalized, her mouth slightly open. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his fingers tapping against his armrest. It was happening too fast, spiraling out of Veronica's control before she could stop it. Her lips moved, but no words came out. James waited a second, just long enough for her to fully absorb the weight of her mistake. Then, his voice dropped dangerously low. "That's what I thought." Veronica's heart pounded as James Anderson's piercing gaze settled on her. Every muscle in her body tensed, but she forced herself to maintain a composed expression. She had handled difficult passengers before. This was no different. Clearing her throat, she straightened her posture and spoke with careful restraint. "Sir, I can explain." James raised an eyebrow, his tone dangerously calm. "I'd love to hear it." The mother still knelt on the floor, clutching her son and the tiny wooden airplane. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but for the first time since boarding, she wasn't the one being scrutinized. Veronica hesitated, sensing that any wrong step could be disastrous. "I was simply enforcing protocol," she said carefully. "Passengers are expected to comply with crew instructions," and she refused. James let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Protocol." He crossed his arms. "Tell me, Miss Summers, which section of the airline's policies allows flight attendants to strike a child?" A collective gasp spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, and a murmur of disbelief rippled through the rows. The businessman who had previously dismissed the incident now leaned forward, suddenly interested. The young executive, still recording, tightened his grip. On his phone, Veronica's stomach dropped. "I didn't." James took a step forward, his presence suffocating. "You didn't." His voice was softer now, but somehow that made it worse. "So every witness here, including the passengers who filmed you, are lying?" Veronica's mouth opened, but no sound came out. James exhaled slowly and turned to the captain. "Captain Evans, you allowed this?" The captain stiffened. "Sir, I wasn't aware of the full situation." James didn't let him finish. He turned back to Veronica. "I built this airline from the ground up. Every policy, every service standard exists to ensure that every passenger, regardless of background, is treated with dignity." His gaze sharpened. "You violated that principle the moment you put your hands on a child." He crouched down beside the mother, who was still gathering her belongings. Without a word, he picked up a few scattered items, the baby wipes, a small sock, and finally, the wooden airplane. He studied it for a moment before extending it toward the mother. She hesitated before reaching out and taking it from him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady. James nodded once before rising to his full height, his expression unreadable. Then his voice turned. Ice cold. "So this is the standard of service my airline upholds?" The question sent a visible shiver through Veronica. "Sir, please, James adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled, as if disappointed. You humiliated a mother, terrorized a child, and disgraced this airline. His tone remained calm, but the weight behind his words was crushing. And you thought you could get away with it. Veronica's knees felt weak. She knew what was coming. James turned slightly toward the captain. I assume we have an open seat in economy? Passengers gasped again. Some whispered excitedly, realizing what was happening. The captain cleared his throat. Yes, sir, we do. James looked at Veronica. Perfect. That's where Miss Summers will spend the remainder of this flight. Her breath hitched. No, you can't. I can, James interrupted. And I just did. He turned to the security officer. Escort her to her new seat. When we land, make sure she's removed from company premises permanently. The mother exhaled shakily, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in hours. Veronica Summers wasn't leaving this flight in first class. She wasn't leaving it as a flight attendant at all. The humiliation she had inflicted on others, she was about to experience it herself. Veronica stood frozen, her face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead, to grasp at any remaining shred of control, but the words refused to come. Around her, the atmosphere had shifted. The same passengers who had once ignored the injustice unfolding before them now watched with undisguised anticipation. The security officer stepped forward, his expression neutral but firm. Ma'am, please come with me. Veronica's chest rose and fell in short, panic breaths. I've served this airline for 15 years, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. You can't. James tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, in a voice that was almost kind, he delivered the final blow. I don't tolerate people who disgrace my company. The security officer gestured for her to move. Slowly, painfully, Veronica took a step back. Every movement felt like walking through quicksand. She turned, eyes darting toward the passengers who had once treated her with deference, searching for support. None came. The businessman who had complained earlier now watched in silence, uninterested in saving her. The silver-haired woman shook her head in quiet disapproval. The young executive smirked slightly, lowering his phone, satisfied with the recording he had captured. Step by step, Veronica walked toward economy, where cramped seats and the murmurs of passengers awaited her. With every foot forward, the power she once wielded slipped further away until she disappeared past the curtain. James adjusted his suit and turned toward the mother. I believe there's an empty seat in first class, he said, his voice lighter now. You and your son should take it. The mother, still processing everything, blinked up at him. What? James gestured toward the now vacant seat, the one Veronica had so eagerly tried to keep her from. She hesitated, unsure if this was real, when her son tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. She made her decision. Rising to her feet, she held her head high and walked back toward where she belonged. Passengers shifted in their seats, watching the moment unfold. The same woman who had been humiliated, mocked, and discarded had now taken her rightful place in first class. The young executive put away his phone, no longer needing to record. Some passengers even smiled, as if justice had been served. James gave her a small nod before stepping aside. The mother settled into her seat, her son curling up beside her, his tiny hand still clutching his wooden airplane. And with that, the flight continued. But Veronica Summers would never fly again. The end. Respect is a right, not a privilege. Veronica thought she could get away with abusing her power, but justice always catches up. If you believe in fairness, dignity, and standing up against injustice, leave a like, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.